He walked into the boardroom with quiet confidence. A billion-dollar deal was about to be sealed. The kind of meeting that could change the future of two global giants. But within minutes, everything unraveled. Not because of numbers. Not because of legal complications. But because no one in the room could speak the same language. They had rehearsed the financials, polished the pitch deck, even planned a celebratory dinner. But they forgot the most human detail of all, understanding each other. A translation app stuttered out the wrong phrase. A polite nod turned into a fatal miscommunication. A janitor ended up becoming the unlikely bridge between worlds. This isn't just a story about business. It's about ego. It's about humility. And it's about what happens when words fail, but silence speaks volumes. So, here's a question for you. In your life, has a small detail ever changed everything? If you're short on time, hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss how this story unfolds. And if you've ever trusted technology a bit too much, well, you might see yourself in the next few minutes. Let's begin. It was supposed to be a perfect day. A Tuesday, crisp and clear, with the kind of golden morning light that makes glass buildings gleam like they're alive. Robert Langley stepped out of the black sedan in front of the Harman Global headquarters. Tall, composed, every inch the CEO of a company valued at $42 billion. His tailored suit whispered confidence. His smile told the world, "I've got this." Inside the building, preparations were already in motion. Coffee brewed. Name cards aligned, translators confirmed. Or at least, they were supposed to be. Robert was scheduled to finalize a partnership with Shentech, one of Asia's fastest-growing technology firms. Months of back and forth. 2 continents. Dozens of late-night calls. It all came down to this meeting. As he entered the elevator, his assistant Emily handed him a final printout. "Everything's in place," she said with a grin. Robert glanced over the list. Presenters, check. Legal team, check. Live interpreter. He stopped reading. "Where's Grace?" Emily blinked. "Grace? I thought she was flying in this morning." Robert's jaw tensed. "She was supposed to be here last night." "I'll check with logistics." But the elevator doors opened before she could finish. They stepped into the top-floor conference room. 20 people already seated. Chinese executives in perfectly cut suits, warm smiles, polite bows. Robert extended his hand. "Welcome." One of the Shentech reps responded in fluent Mandarin. Robert's smile froze. He turned slightly to Emily. Emily turned slightly toward the empty chair behind. Her Grace was not there. One of the Chinese executives continued speaking, hands gesturing gently. Robert nodded, hoping it was appropriate. He gave a small chuckle again, hoping it wasn't wildly offensive. The room began to quiet. A few exchanged glances. Something wasn't right. And just like that, the air changed. The ease of the morning vanished. There was now a silence in the room that wasn't peaceful. It was sharp, tense, like walking across a frozen lake and hearing the first crack. Robert leaned toward Emily. "Text Grace. Call her. Whatever it takes." Emily, already tapping furiously on her phone, whispered, "She's stuck at immigration. Visa delay. Might not make it today." Robert blinked slowly. This couldn't be happening. He was about to discuss intellectual property, long-term joint ventures, and high-level manufacturing rights. And he didn't speak a word of Mandarin. Across the table, one of the Shentech leaders raised a glass of tea. He smiled again and said something warmly. Robert smiled back. He raised his water glass in response. Everyone stared. Apparently, that wasn't the right gesture. Someone coughed. A translator app on a phone buzzed, misunderstood, and said loudly, "We agree to surrender all rights." Silence. Then confusion. Then a chuckle from the back of the room. Everyone turned. It was James, the janitor. The guy who emptied trash bins and whistled jazz in the hallways. He looked up, slightly startled. Sorry, he mumbled. Then, in perfect Mandarin, he added, he meant to say, we're happy to begin the discussion, not surrender. 20 heads turned back to Robert. And then, a long, soft wave of laughter spread across the table. Tension broke. Tea was poured. Conversations resumed, slowly, carefully. Robert looked at James like he was seeing him for the first time. The man spoke fluent Mandarin. He worked nights. And he just saved $1 billion conversation from dying on the floor. Emily whispered. Do we invite him to the table? Robert nodded, still stunned. Pull up a chair. And just like that, the story began to change, not because of a plan, not because of power, but because someone who was never in the plan understood. Sometimes, life sends you a translator when you need one most. And sometimes, that translator wears a janitor's badge. If you find stories like this meaningful, don't forget to hit subscribe so you can come back and continue watching whenever life pulls you away. This was just the beginning. James didn't sit like a janitor anymore. He sat like someone who had just stepped into history by accident and was somehow supposed to stay across the polished table. Conversations began to rebuild slowly, like a bridge after a storm. James translated carefully, his voice calm, his tone respectful. Every word passed through him like a thread stitching two worlds together. Robert watched in awe. This wasn't just about language. It was about rhythm, timing, tone, pauses that meant respect, smiles that carried weight far beyond words. But then came a question from the Shentech side. The lead executive leaned in, eyebrows raised. He spoke a sentence that sounded delicate. James paused. His brow furrowed. He looked to Robert. They're asking about a cultural promise. Something your team mentioned 2 months ago. About shared legacy. It was symbolic, but it mattered. Robert blinked. He remembered the phrase in a memo. Shared legacy through technological harmony. Just marketing fluff. But apparently, not to them. James added gently. To them, that phrase meant trust. It wasn't just branding. Robert sat back, quietly stunned. All the silent signals, all the nods, the carefully timed bows, the metaphors in tea pouring and business cards. They had been speaking. Robert just hadn't known how to listen. He looked at the room now with different eyes. The pauses were not awkward, they were intentional. The smiles were not generic. They carried stories, histories, even regrets, and he'd almost bulldozed over all of it with PowerPoint slides. Suddenly, the doors opened. A team member rushed in late carrying a speaker and a laptop. Good news, she announced too loudly. We've set up Leave AI translation software. It's 94% accurate in Mandarin. Everyone in the room turned. Some curious, some amused. James looked uneasy. The woman clicked start. The AI translator's voice spoke in a strange robotic tone. Dear rice person, your shared body is welcome to us. We drink your family. Silence. Then the oldest Shentech executive burst into laughter. His deep, genuine belly laugh rolled across the table like thunder. Robert lowered his head. He couldn't help it. He laughed too. James smiled, half apologetic. AI is not quite ready for poetry. The meeting paused. For tea again. And in that pause, Robert leaned toward James. How do you speak Mandarin so well? James shrugged. I lived in Taiwan for 20 years. Taught English there. Married a local woman. Life happened. Robert nodded slowly. Not the resume he had expected, not the background HR would have ever checked. But here this man was, holding the meeting together with quiet grace. Moments later, one of the Shentech delegates stood up. He spoke in Mandarin, this time slower, more personal. James translated, his voice slightly quieter. He says, business is important. But today, They're here to see who you are, not just what you offer. That sentence landed heavy. He's here to see who you are. Robert folded his hands. For the first time in a long time. He didn't know what to say. So he did something rare. He stayed quiet, and in that silence, the room softened. This wasn't just a meeting anymore. It was a moment. One that wouldn't have happened if everything had gone as planned. We spend so much of life preparing our words. But maybe the true language of trust begins with learning how to pause. If this part of the story resonates with you, feel free to hit subscribe so you can always return to moments that move you. Because sometimes what you don't say says the most. The second round of discussion began after a brief walk around the rooftop garden. The air was cooler now, the sun dimmer. Robert stood near the glass railing, coffee in hand, his reflection faint against the skyline. He watched James speak softly. With the Shentech delegates inside, there was a warmth in their body language now, less guarded. More human. Emily walked up beside him. "You're doing great," she whispered. He gave a half smile. "No, he's doing great. I'm realizing how far off I was." Back in the room, the conversation was shifting. It was time to talk real numbers, profit shares, manufacturing locations, supply chain logistics. This was Robert's arena. He opened his folder, flipped to page 7, and began presenting in measured tones. James translated in perfect rhythm. The Shentech team listened, nodded, until they didn't. Halfway through a key slide, something changed. One of the executives raised his hand. He asked something brief. James hesitated. Then he looked at Robert and said, "They're confused. This diagram shows 2 plants being closed. But last month, you agreed all 3 would remain open." Robert's hand froze above the page. That must have been a miscommunication." James said nothing. He simply waited. Robert looked to Emily. She scrolled through old emails. Nothing concrete, no written confirmation. Just assumptions. The room grew still again, not hostile, but heavy. James turned to the Shentech team, trying to explain the misunderstanding. He chose his words gently. But words only go so far when trust begins to crack. The oldest executive, Mr. Wei, leaned forward and spoke slowly. James translated. He says, "Misunderstandings are small in words, but large in consequence." Robert felt something inside him drop. It wasn't anger. It was regret. For months, his team had operated on speed. Assumptions. English-only memos. They never thought to double-check with Grace or confirm with local advisors. Now, here in this room of global minds, they were paying the price for their blind spots. "I want to fix this," Robert said quietly. James nodded. "Then we'll start by listening." Just then, the door opened. Grace finally arrived, hair tousled, suit slightly wrinkled, but her expression focused. She nodded quickly to Robert, then turned to the Shentech team and spoke directly in fluent Mandarin. Moment of stunned silence, then smiles. Relief. She turned back to Robert. "They're willing to keep talking, but they want clarity and heart." Robert stepped forward. He looked each executive in the eye, and without reading from his notes, he spoke. "This partnership means more than numbers. It means connection. And I'm sorry we let that part get lost." James translated. Grace added nuance. And Mr. Wei, after a long pause, stood up and offered his hand. It wasn't a handshake of victory. It was a gesture of hope, of second chances. As they wrapped up the day's meeting, the Shentech team thanked everyone and left for their hotel. Robert stayed behind in the conference room, staring at the empty chairs. He thought about all the calls they'd made, all the charts they'd built, all the time spent preparing the wrong things. He looked at James. "You saved us today." James smiled. "Not really, I just heard what others didn't." Then, almost shyly, he added, "Sometimes the missing link isn't a document or a slide. It's just someone willing to ask, what did you mean by that? Robert chuckled softly. It was true. So much had gone unsaid, until it almost cost them everything. If stories like this resonate with you, go ahead and hit subscribe. That way, you'll always find your way back when life gets busy. And maybe, just maybe, you'll hear the signals before they go silent. The next morning began with good intentions. Too good, perhaps. Robert arrived 2 hours early. His suit was the same, but his posture had changed, less rigid. More human. Emily carried a stack of printed apologies, carefully drafted letters of clarification, translated into Mandarin overnight. Grace revised each one twice. They were hoping to clean the slate, as Robert had put it. But there's a strange thing about slates. They don't always clean well. Some marks sink in. The Shentech team arrived precisely on time. No smiles today. Just nods, not cold, but cautious. Robert greeted them personally, handed out the letters, and asked to begin with a short video presentation, one that explained their commitment to transparency. He hit play, and for 10 seconds, it seemed to go smoothly. Then, the screen froze. The audio cut. On the screen, Robert's face was stuck mid-blink, his mouth open, like a man trying to sing opera while sneezing. Someone chuckled. Then someone else did, and within moments, Mr. Wei was laughing so hard he had to wipe his glasses. Robert covered his face, half laughing, half mortified. I think that's enough transparency for one day. The tension cracked. Warmth returned, but not everything could be fixed with laughter. When they shifted to financials again, another surprise came up. One of the Shentech delegates pulled out an older contract draft. It had an outdated clause, something Robert had removed 2 weeks ago. Robert frowned. I never signed that version. But the delegate pointed. It was emailed from your office with your signature. Emily's eyes widened. That might have been sent by Mitchell. He used a draft folder. Robert closed his eyes. Mitchell, the overly eager intern. He'd sent the wrong file. A billion-dollar meeting. Tripped by a college kid with too many windows open. James, ever composed, began gently untangling the confusion. Explaining timelines. Outlining intent, but the moment had slipped. Trust was fragile again. Later, during a break, Robert sat alone near the vending machines. Plastic coffee in one hand. Crinkled apology letters in the other. James sat beside him. Quietly, you okay? He asked. Robert chuckled. You ever try patching a boat while it's still in the water? James grinned. Every Thursday night, my sink leaks. They sat in silence for a while. Then Robert said something unexpected. You know, I used to think being CEO meant being the smartest in the room. He looked up. But lately I think it means being the one most willing to learn. James didn't respond. He just sipped his coffee. Later that afternoon, they reconvened for a final round of talks. This time, no fancy slides. No overly polished speeches, just people talking. Robert stood, no paper in hand. No laptop. Just himself. He told the story of his grandfather, a man who built radios in a shed in Ohio, without speaking a word of any foreign language, but somehow found pen pals in 6 countries through handwritten letters and trust. He said, if that man could build friendships across oceans with nothing but stamps and sincerity, then we can build something real here too. James translated. Grace added depth. And this time, no one looked confused. They just listened. Fully. At the end of the day, the Shentech team agreed to extend negotiations. No final contract. But no doors closed either. A new word was spoken that hadn't been used yet. Possibility. And in many ways, that was worth more than a rushed signature. As everyone packed up for the evening, Robert turned to Grace. Next time we do this. She smiled. You'll speak Mandarin yourself? He laughed. Maybe, or maybe I'll just start by listening better. James gave him a thumbs up from the back of the room, holding a mop bucket. Some of us are fluent in floors and feelings, he joked. Robert grinned, and for the first time in days, he felt like he was finally starting to speak the right language. If you're still with us, consider tapping subscribe, so stories like this are always waiting when you come back. Especially when life gets messy, and you're just trying to patch the boat. By day 3, the tension had faded. Not gone, but softened like the creases in a well-worn shirt. There were smiles again. A few inside jokes. Grace had begun calling Mr. Way the quiet volcano behind the scenes. He never raised his voice. But when he did speak, the room leaned in. That morning, they opened with a light cultural exchange. The Shentech team brought handmade teas. Robert's team offered locally roasted coffee. They laughed about caffeine diplomacy. James made a quiet comment about roasting relationships, not deals, and even Mr. Way cracked a smile that it felt safe. Too safe. Because culture doesn't just live in gestures or food. It hides in assumptions, and sometimes it bites. Later that day, they discussed a clause involving face, not in the literal sense, but in the deep, unspoken Asian concept of dignity, hierarchy, and honor. Robert, unfamiliar with the layers beneath, tried to negotiate it like any other term. It's not personal, he said casually. Just business structure. Silence. Grace's eyes widened. James quietly shook his head. Too late. Mr. Liu, the younger executive beside Mr. Way, sat straighter. His voice, low but tight, responded in Mandarin. James translated slowly. He says, to suggest honor is not personal is to say trust is optional. You could feel the room pull inward. Robert exhaled. He meant no offense. He was trying to find logic in a world built on nuance. I wasn't dismissing anything, he said softly. I was just ... Thinking in Western terms, Mr. Way responded calmly. Again in Mandarin. This time, Grace translated. He says culture is not a costume. You can't wear it when convenient, then take it off when it doesn't fit. Robert lowered his gaze. That one landed. He looked across the table. These weren't obstacles. They were people. And every word, every gesture, every silence, they were all carrying weight. He glanced at James, whose eyes said more than words ever could. The man who mopped floors knew more about the world than most of his boardrooms combined. During lunch, Robert sat alone in the break area, staring at his untouched sandwich. James walked in, holding a tray with 2 teacups. He sat, placed one in front of Robert. No AI, no translators. Just tea, he said. They sipped quietly. Then James spoke. You know what always surprises me? Robert looked up. We spend so much time trying to be impressive, but the moment we get real, that's when people actually start trusting us. Robert nodded slowly. Problem is, I don't always know what real looks like in someone else's culture. James smiled. Then ask. Ask without pretending you already know. That afternoon, Robert returned to the meeting room not as a speaker, but as a listener. He began the session with something unexpected. He placed a photo on the table. It was his late father, standing outside a small hardware store, wearing a dusty apron. This man taught me what work means, Robert said. But he never traveled, never spoke another language. He only knew how to shake a hand and mean it. He paused. I didn't grow up around global tables. I'm learning slowly that meaning doesn't translate word for word. And I'm here to learn yours. The room stayed quiet. Then Mr. Way, after a long moment, stood. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a weathered black and white photo on the table. A rice field. A boy, no older than 10, balancing a basket of water. He said a single phrase. In Mandarin. Grace didn't translate. She didn't need to. Robert just nodded. 2 men. 2 countries. But in that moment, they shared something timeless. Humility. If you've felt that moment, that quiet recognition across cultures, then take a second and hit subscribe. That way, you'll always have a place to come back to when words alone aren't enough. Because sometimes, the bridges we build aren't made of steel or contracts. They're built from stories and the courage to understand. It happened on a Friday, the final day. Everyone thought the hardest part was over. The contract was nearly done. Just signatures, formalities, polite smiles before champagne. Robert adjusted his tie, glanced at Grace, and whispered, "Feels like we're in the clear." She gave a cautious nod. "Just don't jinx it." But jinx it, he did. The conference room was unusually quiet. The Shentech team reviewed the final draft with a kind of ceremonial patience. Robert passed the signed version across the table. Then Mr. Liu frowned. He whispered something to Mr. Wei. Both looked down at the final page. Something was wrong. Grace leaned over, scanning the document. Her eyes widened. "Oh no," Robert froze. "What is it?" Grace looked up. "This version includes the old Article 17. Silence. Article 17 was a clause about exit strategy. In previous talks, Shentech had asked for it to be softened. Robert agreed, but somehow, this final version had reverted. He turned to Emily. Her face drained of color. I sent the wrong draft," she whispered. "It had both versions. In the folder, I must have." She didn't finish. Across the table, Mr. Wei closed the folder slowly. He didn't speak. He didn't scold. He just sat back and breathed. "James tried," he explained. "Clarified, diffused, but words couldn't reach this kind of damage." To the Shentech team, it looked intentional, like a bait-and-switch, like a mask finally slipping. Robert stood. "No, please, this isn't who we are. This isn't what we meant." Mr. Wei finally spoke. "James translated. He says, trust is a vase. Once shattered, even if repaired, the cracks remain." They gathered their things, offered short bows, then left. No champagne, no signatures. Just the faint echo of footsteps down a hallway that suddenly felt much too long. Robert sat, still, silent, hands clenched. Emily burst into quiet tears. "I ruined it," she said. "I ruined everything." But Robert didn't say a word. He COULDN, single quotes D. James placed a hand on her shoulder. "You didn't ruin anything," he said gently. "You made a mistake. That's different. But the damage was real." Later that afternoon, Robert stood in his office, looking out over the skyline. The city had never looked so distant, so cold. He watched people down below, tiny, moving quickly. Lives that would never know about the quiet collapse that happened 30 stories up. Grace walked in. "They've left for the airport." Robert nodded. "They say anything else?" She shook her head. "Just that they need time." Time, the one thing they didn't have. That evening, Robert sat alone in the conference room. Lights dimmed, chairs empty. He looked across the table and saw himself, the version of himself from a week ago. Confident, prepared, unaware. He whispered, almost to no one, "How did we get this far? Just to lose it all?" James entered quietly. He didn't say much. Just brought a pot of tea. No words. Just presence. And in that silence, Robert broke, not loudly, not with drama. Just tears. Quiet, heavy, the kind that don't need explanation. James poured 2 cups, pushed one across the table. Then he said, "You didn't lose everything today. You just found out what you really care about." Robert nodded. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning of doing things differently. And if you've ever had a moment like this, where the thing you wanted slipped through your fingers, but something deeper stayed behind, hit subscribe, because sometimes the collapse isn't the final chapter. It's just the truth finally arriving. Monday came. But the boardroom stayed empty. No new meetings. No buzz of printers. No trays of catered sandwiches. Just silence. Robert sat alone in his office, blinds half drawn, phone off. He hadn't spoken to Emily since Friday. She had taken the weekend off on his orders. He needed time, so did she. So did everyone. Outside, the city moved on. Emails kept coming. Stock tickers crawled across the screen. But inside Robert's mind, nothing was moving forward. The deal was dead, the trust broken. And the worst part wasn't the money. It was the look on Mr. Way's face when he closed the folder. Not angry, not disappointed, just tired. Like a man who had seen this all before. Mid-morning, James knocked gently on the glass door. Robert looked up. Coffee? James nodded. And a question. They sat in the break room, away from the marble tables and designer chairs. James took a sip, then asked, "What did you think this deal was going to give you?" Robert paused. Growth, market access, shareholder confidence. James tilted his head. "No, not what it gives the company. You. What were you chasing?" Robert didn't answer at first. Then quietly, he said, "Validation." He chuckled. Bitterly. "My dad built everything with his hands. He thought what I do was fluff. I just wanted one win big enough to make him proud, even if he's not around to see it." James nodded slowly. "Funny, isn't it? We measure success in numbers but regret in people." That line lingered. Later that day, Robert gathered the team. Emily, Grace, even Mitchell, the intern who had vanished in guilt. He stood in front of them, no slides. No spin, just words. "I messed up," he began. "And not just with a document. I made the mistake of treating this deal like a race, when it should have been a relationship." Emily's eyes watered. "I pushed too hard," he continued. "I skipped the slow parts, the human parts, and now we're here. Not because someone failed, but because I didn't see the real cost of not slowing down." He looked at Mitchell. "You didn't ruin anything," he said. "You reminded us how fragile trust really is." Then he turned to Grace. "And you gave this your whole self. I didn't say thank you, so thank you." She blinked back tears. "And James," Robert said, "you walked into a meeting no one invited you to, and held it together better than I did." James gave a quiet smile. "I just cleaned the parts no one else saw." They all laughed, tired but real. That evening, Robert sat in the conference room one more time. The chairs were still in place, the teacups clean, but now something had shifted inside him. He pulled out a notepad, wrote down 2 words, "Call Way." He didn't know if the deal could be saved, but maybe something else could, not the partnership. The person. He picked up the phone, dialed slowly. Each ring felt like a heartbeat. Voicemail. He waited, then left a message. "Mr. Way, this is Robert Langley. I know the deal is off the table, but I'd like to meet you again. No contracts, no business, just to talk, to listen. If you're willing, I'll be in Taipei next week, on my own dime. I hope we can share a cup of tea, not to rebuild a deal, just to rebuild respect." He hung up. And in that moment, he realized what he had truly lost. Not the contract, not the revenue, but the lesson that came too late, and the relationships that may never return. But also, what he had gained: clarity, humility, and maybe, just maybe, a second chance. If you've ever lost something that mattered more than money and found yourself in the quiet after, you're not alone. Hit subscribe if this resonates. Sometimes the most expensive thing we ever pay is attention. It was raining in Taipei. Not the hard, angry kind. The soft kind. The kind that slows your steps without asking permission. Robert sat in a quiet tea house tucked between bookstores and calligraphy shops. The walls were warm wood, no Wi-Fi, no music, just the sound of water and breath and patience. He wore no tie, carried no briefcase. Just a small notebook and 2 envelopes. One for Mr. Wei, one he hadn't dared to open yet. The old woman who ran the shop placed 2 porcelain cups on the table. No words, just a nod. Then she disappeared behind a curtain. Moments later, footsteps, soft, measured. Then a figure appeared at the door. Mr. Wei. He entered slowly, folding an umbrella with quiet care. He wore the same dark suit, but no expression. He sat across from Robert. No handshake, no immediate words, just 2 men, 2 cups of tea. And time. Minutes passed before either spoke. Finally, Robert cleared his throat. "Thank you for coming." Mr. Wei nodded slightly. "I didn't come to change your mind," Robert said. "I came to understand what I failed to." Still, silence. Then Mr. Wei spoke, not to argue, but to remember. He told a story of his grandfather, who had once lost an entire rice harvest because he trusted the wrong supplier. He spoke not with bitterness, but with clarity. "Loss," he said, "is not the punishment. Loss is the teacher." Robert listened. Truly listened. Then he slid the envelope across the table. "It's not a proposal," he said. "It's a letter. Just something I needed to say, without lawyers, without spin." Mr. Wei didn't open it, just tucked it into his coat. That was enough. Then Mr. Wei pulled something from his own pocket. It was an old stone, perfectly smooth, worn by decades of river current. He placed it on the table. "A gift," he said in Mandarin. Grace had taught Robert enough to understand that much. Robert picked it up, turned it in his hand. Heavy, simple, real. "What does it mean?" he asked. Mr. Wei answered slowly. "In our culture, stones from rivers carry the memory of movement without needing to speak of it." Then he stood. No promises, no business. Just a small bow and a departure. Robert remained, holding the stone. He didn't feel triumphant, but he didn't feel defeated either. He felt changed. Later that evening, in the quiet of his hotel room, Robert finally opened the second envelope. Inside was a note Grace had written weeks ago. He'd forgotten she gave it to him before the big meeting. It read, "Whatever happens, don't forget, leadership isn't about being right. It's about being real, even when it's messy. Especially when it's messy." He smiled. He folded the note, placed it next to the river stone, and sat by the window, watching the rain. The next morning, before his flight, Robert stopped by a street vendor selling handmade calligraphy scrolls. He asked the artist to write one phrase. He didn't know how to say it perfectly in Mandarin, but he pointed to his heart when he said it. The artist understood. The scroll now hangs in his office back home. It reads, "The quietest lessons leave the deepest marks." And if this story left a mark on you, the kind that doesn't shout, but stays with you in the quiet, then take a moment. Hit subscribe. Not just to support a channel, but to carry stories like this into more hearts. Because in the end, what we build through humility, what we learn through listening, what we remember through silence, that's the real legacy. As someone who's spent a lifetime studying people, I can tell you this. The most powerful shifts don't happen in boardrooms. They happen in the quiet. In the pause between what was said and what was meant. In the silence after the meeting ends and before regret sets in. Robert didn't lose the deal because of one email. He lost it the moment he stopped listening. But he found something far more valuable when he started again. And maybe that's the lesson we all needed. That leadership isn't about control, it's about connection. And sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is simply say, "I don't understand yet, but I'm willing to learn." Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment where silence said more than words? Where a simple misunderstanding changed everything? Or where listening, really listening, saved something precious? Share your story in the comments. This channel isn't just about storytelling. It's about story sharing. And if this message stayed with you, if it made you think of someone or reminded you of something worth remembering. Subscribe so stories like this find their way back to you when the noise of life gets too loud. And if you're ready for the next chapter, we have another true story waiting for you in the next video. Click and join us. Because some of the most unforgettable moments in life are whispered, not shouted.